Yeah, I was recently in Georgia, and in Georgia, the country that is, and the prime minister there, he also attended the same conference, and he also made the same point that the NGOs in his country was trying to, well, effectively stage a regime change or another color revolution to use Georgia as well, use it as a second front line against the Russians. It's yeah, also from all the way to India, you had a foreign minister be very vocal about how undesirable as George Soros is within India, and also this other, also called non-governmental organizations. Um, but when we had, for example, USAID cut its financing, um, again, it's not an NGO; it's directly funded by the State Department. But then there was all this interesting. Well, it became a bit of a watershed moment because suddenly we saw that 85 to 90% of Ukrainian media had been financed by this. I mean, how extensive, especially in Ukraine, because this has been a I mean, the former general prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, was making the point that after 2014, they were being run as a colony, more or less. And it seems as if the so-called NGOs had a very key role in this. What is the relationship then with the media?
Well, Victor Shokin would know his firing as prosecutor happened because of USAID as well. If you recall, when Joe Biden made that famous confession to the Council on Foreign Relations that he personally flew to Kiev and threatened the Ukrainian government that if they didn't fire Victor Shokin, they would lose a $1 billion loan guarantee. So it would cost $1 billion to keep Victor Shokin as prosecutor. What was that $1 billion loan guarantee in reference to? It was a USAID loan guarantee conditioned on governance reforms, governance which is folded into rule of law, which is effectively allows the U.S. to control the Ministry of Justice within Ukraine. Every aspect of Ukrainian civil society is funded top to bottom by USAID and has been. From the media, as you mentioned, up to 90% of Ukrainian media, or including some of the largest ones like the Kiev Independent, are USAID funded. The NGO organizations like the OCCRP, the Corruption and Reporting Project, which ended up digging up dirt on Rudy Giuliani with USAID dollars, and that spiraled into the Ukraine to the impeachment of the president in 2019. They got half of their budget from USAID and the State Department, which and there's an amazing documentary that folks can look up, filmed by a German production team, with all their insider confessions on how this works in terms of editorial control, hiring and firing rights by the State Department and USAID. But it's also the union groups. For example, Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the most influential teachers unions in the United States, was constantly going overseas to Ukraine to work with the teachers unions in Ukraine to make sure that the children are being taught a new mythology about their own history, and that any affinity with Russia or Russian, any sort of positive involvement between the Russian and Ukrainian people and the different ethnic cleavages is purged from Ukrainian textbooks. And so the minds of Ukrainian school children are controlled by the U.S. State Department. Even the arts and culture, if you recall, there was an incredible scandal ahead of the 2016 election here in the United States around a woman named Marina Abramovich, who was responsible for this spirit cooking phenomenon. This is this kind of ghastly, kind of ghoulish, almost satanic kind of culture development. They involved strange things with bodies made to look like they're dead, and these very strange kind of almost devil worship things. She then partnered with the U.S. State Department to run arts and culture development within Ukraine. And again, this is to curate Ukraine's museums, and it's sponsored graffiti on buildings and public artworks so that they all are purged of any kind of legacy affiliation with Russia. They're trying to memory hole 1984. That there ever was a kind of Russian language within Ukraine, or a kind of shared history, so that Ukraine can become fully European in that way and be folded into NATO and into EU markets, and so that its own natural gas and rare earth minerals and agricultural assets can be completely gobbled up by Wall Street and London. But it's completely totalizing in terms of USAID in Ukraine. In fact, USAID was even paying for the pensions and retirement funds for Ukrainian firefighters, police officers, school teachers, while the United States is struggling with veterans who are poor and dying under bridges in our big cities. Instead of paying for their pensions or their retirements, or trying to pay for affordable housing or health care in the United States, where the average homeowner is not, it has to wait until 40 years old now in the United States. A generation ago, it was almost half of that. The USA, that money is going so that I think it was $15 billion in USAID funding to Ukraine alone could pay off the agriculture workers, the pensions, the government employee salaries of folks in Ukraine. This is done to keep vassal state control over Ukraine's internal politics. They don't want, the money is the hook to keep them voting for that system. We call it hearts and minds work, this kind of influencing domestic groups, but it's not really hearts and minds. It's hearts and minds and cash. The cash is what pays for the hearts and minds much more effectively than propaganda itself. You obviously pay cash for the propaganda to influence the hearts and minds, but when people's livelihoods depend on USAID funding, they will vote for, they will be in the streets for, they will do what they're told to make sure that USAID funding keeps flowing. That's what we saw, and this is one of the reasons that I think that the State Department was behind the decision to cancel elections in Ukraine, and why there was no outcry about the threat to democracy from elections being canceled against Zelensky, is because that hearts and minds question is the critical one. If Ukraine were allowed to vote their way out of their foreign policy, they'd choose a different one. And the U.S. State Department, to date, has not wanted to allow that to happen.